There was a time when every corner of the internet was buzzing about a tiny kid who looked like he could take on the basketball world. He wasn't just playing the game, he was putting on a show. Step backs from deep, no-look passes, ankle-breaking crossovers, all from a kid who barely stood taller than the ball rack. That kid was Julian Newman. At just 11 years old, he wasn't just good, he was everywhere. ESPN, Ball is Life, talk shows, NBA halftime events. He was hailed as the next big thing in basketball. Julian was supposed to be the future, the first truly viral basketball star who would actually make it. He was the kid who was going to prove that you could build a path to the NBA on talent, confidence, and a million highlight clips. He was flashy, fearless, and fun to watch. But here's the thing about hype. It has to eventually meet reality. In Julian Newman's reality, it was brutal. Because while the mixtapes made him look like the next Allen Iverson, the truth was that Julian Newman had one thing working against him that no amount of training could fix: his body. At 5'7" with average athleticism, he was fighting physics every time he stepped on the court. Basketball is a sport that rewards size, length, and explosion, and Julian just didn't have them. And when you're that small, you have to be special, like truly once-in-a-generation special to make it work. And Julian wasn't just fighting against his genetics, he was fighting against himself. The confidence that made him go viral also made him stubborn. He doubled down on flash instead of refining the fundamentals that could have helped him survive against bigger, faster defenders. He leaned into the spotlight and leaned into the persona even when the results on the court were telling him something needed to change. And that's why this story is so fascinating. Because Julian Newman didn't just fail to live up to the hype, he physically couldn't get to the next level. And when his body wouldn't take him there, his approach to the game made sure he stayed stuck. So let's rewind back to where it all started. To really understand how Julian Newman ended up on such a strange path, you have to go back to where it all started. Julian wasn't just some random kid who picked up a ball one day and got lucky on YouTube. Basketball was baked into his DNA. His father, Jamie, was by no means a professional player, but he had more than enough passion for basketball to build his entire life around it. Enough passion to make basketball his son's entire identity. Jamie wasn't the kind of dad who casually tossed his son a ball in the driveway. He put Julian through what can only be described as a mini military training program for basketball. By the time most kids were still figuring out how to multiply, Julian was already putting up 100 free throws, 200 floaters, and 200 jump shots a day. It wasn't optional, it was their lifestyle. And the results showed early. By the age of 5, Julian already had serious handles. By the age of 9, he was starting to get local attention in Florida for playing against kids years older than him, and cooking them. He wasn't just good for his age, he was flat out good. Then came the moment that changed everything. 2012. Julian was just an 11-year-old 5th grader when grainy clips of him tearing up varsity players at Downey Christian School started circulating online. This was before TikTok, before social media algorithms were cranking out highlight reels every 5 minutes, so if you went viral back then, it meant something. And Julian went viral in a big way. The footage was electric. A tiny kid with a baby face and an oversized jersey putting grown teenagers on skates, draining step-back threes, and celebrating with the confidence of a 25-year-old. It looked like something out of a movie, like if someone had taken Kyrie Irving's dribble package and uploaded it into a middle schooler. National media jumped on the wave. Sports Illustrated, The New York Times, Ellen, Good Morning America. Everybody wanted a piece of the child prodigy. ESPN even ran segments on him. He performed at halftime of Orlando Magic games. His highlight tapes were racking up millions of views, with one mixtape alone clearing 3.5 million views. And this wasn't just smoke and mirrors, at least not yet. Julian was putting up real numbers. As a 4'5" 5th grader, he averaged 12.4 points, 11 assists, and 4.3 steals per game in his first 3 varsity starts, leading Downey Christian to a 21-6 record. By middle school, he had games where he scored 40, 50, even 91 points. By 7th grade, he had already crossed the 1,000-point mark in varsity play. By 8th grade, he was averaging nearly 20 points and 10 assists per game against high school competition. Numbers that would make any player look like a star, let alone a kid barely in his teens. And the style? That's what sold it. Julian was small, but he played loud. Every bucket came with flair. deep threes, flashy passes, circus layups, crossovers that sent defenders stumbling backward. He played with a chip on his shoulder, like he was out to prove he belonged on every possession. He was the perfect storm for the early social media era. The size difference made him look like an underdog. The stats gave him credibility. The flair made him viral. By the time he was in 8th grade, Julian Newman wasn't just a talented kid, he was a brand. He had signature gear, national interviews, a growing fan base, and a growing group of skeptics who thought the whole thing was just a carefully manufactured PR stunt. But even if you didn't like the hype, you couldn't ignore him. Julian was everywhere. He was, without question, the most famous middle school basketball player in America. And for a lot of people, the question wasn't if he would make it, but how far he would go. By the time Julian Newman entered high school, he wasn't just a local star. He was a national name, and the numbers kept piling up. He blew past Florida's all-time scoring record, finishing with over 6,200 career points, 4th most in national history. He set records for assists and three-pointers. He became a stat sheet monster, the kind of player you'd think every Division I recruiter would be chasing. But here's where things started to get weird. Despite the numbers, the recruiting calls weren't coming. Julian wasn't ranked on major sites like Rivals or 24/7 Sports. ESPN barely mentioned him in their prospect coverage, and by the time he was a junior, scouts had almost completely stopped showing up to his games. For a kid who had built his entire identity on being the guy, this was the first real crack in the image. The question became unavoidable. If Julian was really this good, why wasn't anybody offering him? And then came the matchups that would define and ultimately destroy the narrative. Julian had spent years being compared to another internet prodigy, LaMelo Ball. Both were flashy guards. Both grew up in the public eye. Both had mixtapes with millions of views. So when Prodigy Prep, the basketball program Julian's dad literally created just so Julian could be the centerpiece, faced off against Spire Academy and LaMelo, the internet was ready for the battle of the prodigies. But what was supposed to be Julian's crowning moment turned into a reality check. LaMelo, who had just returned from playing professional basketball overseas, looked like an NBA prospect. He controlled the tempo, made the game look easy, and casually put up a triple-double. Julian, he looked like a kid trying to keep up. The handle was still there, but it wasn't fooling elite defenders. The step-back threes that had worked in middle school were now heavily contested or outright blocked. He was still pulling up shots, but he wasn't impacting the game. And the more he forced the issue, the more it felt like he was performing for the cameras instead of playing to win. For the first time, the viral sensation looked small. If Spire was a wake-up call, IMG Academy was the nightmare. IMG wasn't just a team, they were a factory, a roster loaded with 4-star and 5-star recruits, future pros, and elite athletes at every position. When Prodigy Prep faced IMG, it wasn't a game, it was a demolition. IMG didn't just beat Julian's team, they destroyed him. The final margin? 60 points. Julian was visibly frustrated, forcing shots, barking at teammates, and even throwing a chair during a stoppage. His emotions were boiling over. The team actually played better when he was off the floor, and the cameras caught it all. The viral kid who had once dominated the internet was now going viral for all the wrong reasons. And that's when the narrative started to change. For years, Julian's hype had been bulletproof. He was the little guy sticking it to the giants, the viral star who had made the game look fun. But now, he wasn't just undersized, he was overmatched. Scouts weren't seeing a diamond in the rough anymore. They were seeing a player who had hit his ceiling. The size was a problem, the athleticism was a problem, and worst of all, the game hadn't grown. Julian was still playing like a YouTube player, hunting highlights, taking tough shots, and trying to win the crowd, even as the competition passed him by. By the time he reached his senior year, Julian Newman wasn't a surefire Division I prospect. He wasn't even a maybe, he was an afterthought. And this is where the story stops being about hype and starts being about reality. Because what we were watching wasn't just a kid struggling, it was a kid running into the one thing he couldn't dribble past, his physical ceiling. By the end of his high school career, the picture was becoming painfully clear. Julian Newman wasn't just underrated, he wasn't just overlooked. He had run headfirst into a wall that no amount of mixtapes could knock down. And to be fair, a big part of that wall wasn't his fault. Julian stood somewhere between 5'5" and 5'7", depending on who you ask. In a sport where the average point guard in the NBA is 6'3", that's already a massive uphill battle. But height alone doesn't kill your chances. Nate Robinson was 5'9" and won 3 slam dunk contests. Isaiah Thomas was 5'9" and finished 5th in MVP voting in 2017. Muggsy Bogues was 5'3" and played 14 years in the league. But here's the difference. All of those guys were elite at something physically. Nate had a 40-inch vertical and explosive speed. Isaiah was one of the most skilled finishers under the rim in NBA history. Muggsy had generational quickness and vision. Julian, he wasn't elite at any of it. He didn't have that first step burst to blow past defenders. He wasn't a vertical threat at the rim. He didn't have the strength to absorb contact and still finish. Every bucket against real competition looked like a war just to get the shot off. Even his best skill, his handle, didn't scale up against elite athletes. He could dribble through his legs 5 times in a row, but he wasn't actually creating separation. His crossovers became more for show than for results. And then there was the jumper. Julian's shot form had always been unorthodox. A low chest-level release that worked when he was shorter and faster than everyone else, but by the time defenders were 6'6" with long arms, it was a liability. His jumper was easy to contest, and the percentages showed it. But the physical limitations weren't the only problem. Julian also had an approach to the game that didn't help his case. Instead of adjusting to the reality of his size and working to become a more efficient, smarter floor general, he doubled down on being the show. He hunted step-back threes, heat-check mid-range shots, and flashy crossovers even when the game situation called for patience and control. His assist numbers looked good, but they were inflated by playing in systems completely built around him. Scouts could see through it. They saw a guard who wasn't breaking defenses down, wasn't manipulating defenders, and wasn't elevating teammates the way a true point guard should. And then there was the attitude. Confidence is crucial when you're undersized. You have to believe you can hang with bigger players, but there's a fine line between confidence and ego, and Julian walked that line, sometimes stepping way over it. There were visible outbursts on the court, clashes with teammates, rumors about locker room tension. Scouts whispered that he wasn't coachable, and when things went badly, like in the IMG blowout, Julian let his frustration spill over, throwing a chair in front of everyone. This was the other half of the equation. Yes, Julian was physically limited, but instead of finding ways to work around those limits, like developing elite decision-making, becoming a defensive pest, or mastering efficiency, he kept playing the same way he always had. In other words, he mastered performance, but never progression. And by the time he got to the point where he had to prove himself against real athletes, the gap had grown too big to close. Julian's game wasn't broken, it was just stuck. And in basketball, if you're not growing, you're falling behind. After high school, Julian's path got much more unclear. The Division I offers his father claimed existed never materialized publicly. Julian said he was skipping college entirely to go pro overseas to either Germany, Italy, China, or even the G League were thrown out as possibilities, but none of those opportunities came to life according to the Newmans. But in reality, none of those opportunities were likely even real. For a while, Julian faded into the background. He and his family focused on building the Prodigy brand, dropping YouTube content, teasing one-on-one shows like Beat Julian Newman, and keeping his name alive online. He even trained in Las Vegas for a while, far away from the Florida spotlight that once followed him everywhere. Then came a surprising twist. In 2024, 4 years after his high school graduation, Julian finally stepped back onto a real basketball court. Not for Duke, not for Kentucky, not even for a mid-major D1 school. He suited up as a 23-year-old freshman for Bethesda University, which is a tiny NCCAA program, which if you don't know is the National Christian College Athletic Association. And unfortunately, what happened next wasn't a redemption arc, it was confirmation. Julian played just 4 games for Bethesda. In those 4 games, he averaged just 3 points per game on 12% shooting from the field. He went 0 for 17 from three-point range. He shot 33% from the free throw line. And the losses? They were staggering. Bethesda was losing games by an average of 53 points per night. One game they lost by 60, another by 69. And Julian wasn't just struggling quietly. He was forcing shots, trying to play hero ball, but nothing was falling. For a player once touted as the future of basketball, this wasn't just a bad stat line, it was a harsh reality check. Against some of the lowest level college competition in the country, Julian didn't look like a former viral phenom. He looked like a guy desperately trying to keep his dream alive. It was sobering to watch, and it left fans wondering, if this is where Julian is now, how much further could he really go? So here's the question everyone always comes back to. Was Julian Newman ever really that good? The answer is complicated. As a kid, absolutely. He was miles ahead of other 11-year-olds. He worked hard, he believed in himself, he brought an energy to the game that made people tune in. For a time, he was everything we love about basketball: creativity, confidence, and pure joy. But here's the thing about youth basketball. The game never stops getting better. And when you're 5'7" without elite athletic tools, the window to separate yourself is small. Julian never made that leap. He stayed the same player he'd always been, which was fine when he was 12, but by the time he was 18, everyone else had caught up physically and mentally. The flash was still there, but the results weren't. And while his physical limitations were always going to make his path nearly impossible, his approach didn't help. He leaned into the mixtape era instead of evolving into a true point guard. He leaned into the cameras instead of grinding in the shadows. He leaned into being Julian Newman instead of becoming the player he needed to be to survive at the next level. That's what makes this story so fascinating, and honestly, a little heartbreaking. Because in some ways, Julian Newman is a victim of timing. He blew up in an era where going viral was the end goal, where being famous felt like making it. But fame doesn't get you to the NBA, development does. And Julian's development froze right when he needed it most. He'll always be remembered as the kid who went viral, the little guard with the big game who had the internet on fire, but he'll also be remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder that early success doesn't guarantee long-term greatness. Sometimes, no matter how hard you work, no matter how badly you want it, your body just won't take you where you want to go. So what do you think? Was Julian Newman doomed from the start, or could he have made it if he changed his game? Let us know in the comments. Because whether you saw him as a prodigy or a cautionary tale, Julian Newman will always be remembered as the kid who broke the internet but never broke through.